When did you know you were first an audiophile? This question comes from Scott in Baltimore, Maryland. And he writes, do you remember the moment when you realized you were an audiophile? What if, that's when I went to a shrink. What, if any, audio magazines inspired you, and which magazines did you not fully respect and why? Lastly, were there any highly talented recording engineers that were known for producing fantastic recordings? Kind regards, Scott. I'm not sure I can remember all those questions. I might even have to look back at this thing. All right, when did I know I was an audiophile? Well, for those of you who have stuck with this series, you've probably heard the story of how we started PS Audio. And I'll relay just part of it, just to give you a bit of the flavor of how I'm going to answer that question. And I've said this 50 times, and I know people are getting tired of hearing it. I am writing a book. It's a memoir. And right now, the title of it is 99% True. That's the title. And yeah, it also talks about it. So it's got a little funny edge to it. And it goes through all of this. But in 1973 and 1974, somewhere, I think 73, I had built a phono preamplifier for a radio station, and I had taken it over to one of the radio station's sponsors, Ball Waterbed Company, and the owner of Ball Waterbed, Norm, had an amazing stereo system, and it was legendary throughout all of the giant metropolis of Santa Maria, California. and I had never seen Norm's stereo system, but I had heard of it. It truly was legend. People talked about this guy with this stereo system. And I brought over my little prototype of the phono preamplifier. It was in a Roytan cigar box with two 9-volt batteries and I had cobbled this thing together and wanted a place to test it. So Norm took one look at the box that, had my little, on the side of the cigar box, it had two little inputs and output jacks, and he said, "You're not hooking that up to my stereo system. It doesn't even have a plug. I got thousands invested in this thing. If you want to hook that up to someone's stereo system to see how it sounds, let me introduce you to Stan Warren." Stan was Norm's waterbed installer, also an audiophile. And so I met Stan. He took me over to his little house in Orchid, California, a little shack of a place. And I walked into Stan, which is a whole story in itself, with a turntable. He had drilled holes through his wooden floor and had mounted the turntable. The poles that held the turntable up were mounted into the dirt, and I'd never seen anything like this. And Stan played the phono preamplifier. He compared it to his Dynaco Pat 4 and kept going, and didn't say a whole lot, but at the end of it he goes, "That's really good sounding. I would have no problem endorsing that, sell it to the radio station to be in good shape." Okay. About 2 weeks later, I got a knock on the door, and it was Stan. I'd only met him this one time. So Stan walks through the door, said, "You got a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And he took $500 cash out of his pocket, plunked it down on the table, and said, "I want to buy half of your company." Now, I had just lost a company called Infinitizer, which was, I had invented the world's first polyphonic synthesizer, and this was years ago. And it's another long story. It's also covered in the book. I got ripped off by my subcontractor, and he ran off with all the money. And here I was, destitute and broke, no longer with a company, still thinking about synthesizers, having built this phono preamplifier to make a few bucks for the radio station. Stan plunks down $500 cash, said, "I just sold my van. I want to buy half your company." I'm thinking, I don't even know what company he's talking about, but I'll take the $500. So I grabbed the money and said, "Sure, what company are we talking about?" He said, "The one that's going to build that little phono box." Okay, what do we call it? We call it Paul and Stan Audio, PS Audio. Sounds good to me. But Who's going to buy that little phono box? Audiophiles. Now that was the first time I'd ever heard the term audiophile, and it progressed from there. So with that little backstory, sorry to diverge there, but I think it's important because it's all part of the story. So the first time that I really knew I was an audiophile is when I actually had a chance to go to Norm's system. And there, Norm had this Triamped audio research setup, Janssen electrostats, Serwin Vega 18-inch woofers. I mean, this thing, a Rabco turntable with a linear tracking arm, and a freezer full of hash. So we would go to Norm's house, open up the freezer, smoke a bowl of hash, sit down, and he would crank this thing up, and I was like, holy crap. I had no idea that anything could sound even remotely close to this. Now, I had hi-fi speakers. I had a pair of phased arrays. I had a Kenwood integrated. I eventually moved over to a Dynaco. So I had what I thought was a good hi-fi system, but I was not an audiophile, and Norm and his system had a lot to do with me becoming an audiophile, and that's the first time. So what was the other question here? So we don't take this too long. Which magazine? Stereo Review sucked. Back then, there was Stereo Review, Julian Hirsch. He was the first of the Flatlanders that, well, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. We'll have to give him the Snake Award, which is another thing I'm introducing on here, the Snake Award. So if we're talking about stuff that involves snake oil, that you guys are thinking about snakes, then here comes the snake. Here comes the Snake Award. And so I didn't like that magazine because it didn't talk about how things sounded. Imagine having a car magazine without talking about how the cars drive. You can have dynamometers and all this stuff that's, it's got 3 billion horsepower and blah, 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 right? But how does it drive? How does it feel when you get in? Does it set you back in the seat? Does your hair turn on fire? Whatever. So that magazine rarely ever, if ever, talked about how things sounded. And that wasn't until a little bit with Audio Magazine, where we first started advertising, then the Absolute Sound and Stereophile. Now those magazines really started talking about how things sounded and got us where we wanted to go. Anyway, I've babbled long enough. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow.